Сегодня буду говорить про постпозитивистское регулирование новых технологий. So thanks for this opportunity to speak again. And as I said, I'll continue to share my Western experience with my Russian colleagues about regulation of new technologies. And today we'll talk about post-positivist governance of newly emerging technosciences, something on which I've been working with colleagues in Germany for a long time by now. And there will be a special issue out, hopefully very soon in October. And also, so I'll mention that in the presentation. So why these questions about post-positivist governance of emerging sciences and technologies? Well, I guess that's pretty much kind of a next very sort of obvious step from the STS experience over the past 40 years that in science and technology studies that have questioned positivist understandings of science, including scientific rationality, objectivity, and value neutrality for the past 40 years, as I said. So there's increasingly you can hear calls for political, even legal accountability of scientists, for example, in the cases of geoengineering, when large projects are being observed in the sense that how safe they are in terms of protecting and not damaging, harming the globe. There is also quite a bit of conversations about reconsideration of the social contract of science over the past 10 or 15 years at least. There is also the need for new approaches engaging with the changing world, including more feminist perspectives, considering post-Cold War approaches to the governance of science and technology, as well as increasing interest to the post-colonial technoscience as well. There is also an interest and quite a bit of attention to the new emerging fields of highly visionary science and technologies, such as nanotechnology or synthetic biology. And as you've seen in Rachel's presentation, that's very much tied up with the new direction in responsible research and innovation. So all that, I think, necessitates questions about whether we can build approaches to what we might call post-positivist governance that will incorporate all the sensibilities that we know from science and technology studies, and not only in the governance of emerging sciences and technology. So this is a special issue which is coming out in October, STS technology assessment and policy interactions and the governance of technovisionary sciences. And we are lucky to have Arif here, who is also contributing a chapter to this special issue. Well, if you think of challenges that contemporary policymakers are facing, there are increasing cases of technopolitical activism, such as we can see in this picture with Edward Snowden's affair. There are also instances of eco-terrorism, such as bombing of nanotechnology labs in Mexico. All that has to be taken into account as well as designing new approaches to the governance of science and technology. There is also a kind of unusual increase in something that we might call techno-love, technoscience in popular culture. The Big Bang Theory has been around for a while. If you watch the Russian TV, as I do very often, the STS channel, you will see this short series which is called the Unreal Stories, Unreal History, if you like. When these episodes about the Soviet scientists in Sharashki, there's a kind of special places, almost like prison-like places, where they were put under the control of their military bosses, producing useful technologies. So I recommend if you wanted to watch those. There is a series about Mendeleev, the inventor of the Mendeleev periodical table as well, which I find quite funny too. On the policy level as well, I think the need to reconsider the status of science and society has been pronounced very forcefully in the European Commission and their report taking European knowledge society seriously, which deconstructed the master narratives of science, technology and society, saying that there's been that we need to question a few moments about, which include a strong association between science, technology and progress, the language of objectivity and rationality ascribed to science and engineering, the narrative of unintended consequences which is very makes a prominent part of the science narrative, which features in the dominant narratives of failure of technoscience as well. And such master narratives of science also attribute ambiguous status to the publics as problem or solution for technological progress. As well as follows from that report, and not only, the master narratives of the 20th century science can be associated with powerful political processes involving the nuclear weapons race and the Cold War. And also other commentators, as Arivi, observed that science and technology are dominant political forms in themselves. So there is the need for new forms of assessment and governance of science and technology if we want to reconsider the master narratives, if we want to introduce new sensibilities that have been developed in science and technology studies. So with my colleague in ITAS, Institute for Technology Assessment and System Analysis in Karlsruhe in Germany, we have been working on new approaches that would incorporate technology assessment, MSCS, into science and technology governance and policy. And we brought, and that's going to be a special issue as well, a kind of a brief history of technology assessment, which began with the Office of Technology Assessment in the US Congress, funding for which stopped in the end of the 90s, with kind of ambiguous stories for why that happens. Maybe someone can clarify that later. There are also, Armin Grunwald lists several characteristic features of early technology assessment, classic technology assessment, which includes positivism, etatism, orientation to the state, comprehensiveness, quantification, prognosticism, and an orientation towards experts. The quantification of early technology assessment was mostly about the production of hard knowledge about science, something that STS has looked at for a long, long time by now. And also the critique towards the early technology assessment was framed in the form of the critique of expertocracy, of fixation on the state, and silencing of the plurality, lack of deliberative exercises in assessing and governing science and technology. Instead, as Grunwald proposes, that we need to increasingly think in alternatives. We need to incorporate new approaches into technology assessment based on the idea of social construction of technology. And again, the constructive technology assessment? Yep. Constructive technology assessment is a new form of technology assessment that attempts to incorporate reflexively all these sensibilities about science and technology governance. Well, Christopher and I have been looking a lot at the interpretive challenges of emerging technologies. We were wondering and were very curious about these new technovisionary fields, which include nanotechnology, synthetic biology, human enhancement, and converging technologies. What we can observe by looking at the visionary statements, visionary claims associated with these new emerging fields is their strong and contentious ideological claims and very early claims about their potential ethical, legal, and societal aspects. If you look at foundational documents, for example, papers written by Mike Progu, the architect of the National Nanotechnology Initiative in the United States, you will see very strong emphasis not just on technical change that nanotechnologies will bring, but also social change. There is almost utopian visions about what nanotechnologies will bring and what they might accomplish with regard to the socio-technical change eventually. So these visions are also very strongly shaped by ideas of progress, revolutionary implications, to the extent that philosophers of science, Alfred Norman and also Arivi here as well, warned about speculative ethics, in the sense that a continuous production of this highly visionary, revolutionary claims about new sciences and technologies. But also, that kind of suspicion about these claims has also helped to bring social sciences and humanities for technology marketing purposes, and also almost instrumentalize social sciences and humanities for almost like PR for this new emerging techno-scientific initiatives. So the question that we are very curious about is that whether we got stuck in the vicious circle of inflated promises about these new sciences and technologies. Well, we thought quite a bit about what we look at when we consider sciences and technology from the interpretivist perspective. And we can almost talk about the interpretivist turn in science and technology policy these days, when we assume that the sciences and technologies can be converted into something that we call TA interpretandum. That's something that technology assessment attempts to interpret and make inferences about the need for such technologies, the futures that they bring, and the institutions that need to support them. And we consider, we were puzzled by this idea that you can actually launch these fields of science and technology which are highly malleable in terms of the promise that they carry, in terms of interpretations, estimations of the markets that they will bring as well. And that's quite striking if you look at these visions that these fields are produced, if you compare that with the cloning of Dolly the sheep, which is perhaps might be an easy example to analyze or assess, rather than dealing with these highly visionary, malleable fields where many actors are involved, scientific institutions, policy institutions, as well as all the deliberative exercises that have been designed, accomplished to involve publics in making decisions about these sciences and technologies. So again, our concern is about how, not just making assessments of technology, but also how technology assessment is being made. What we are trying to do is try to understand TA, technology assessment, as a knowledge production institution in itself, following the practice turn, as we know from science and technology studies. In a sense, TA itself can be understood as a laboratory, as our colleagues from ITAS are telling us. And in case it becomes a case for STS, for science and technology studies, to deconstruct expert narratives in technology assessment and try to understand forms of assessment better, including reflections of our role in technology assessment as well. And what intrigues me from science and technology studies perspective is that what kind of turn we are making and how can it help us to reconsider and pose questions about key terms of assessment. What do we mean by knowledge? What do we mean by science? And what do we mean by technology? So we ask whether there might be a possible dialogue between science and technology studies and technology assessment that will help to look at all these key terms. Whether it helps us to examine assumptions and potential for possibly critical dialogue between STS and CA, or whether we can initiate a new form of collective inquiry to examine claims for adequacy of assessment of scientific truth. So in a sense we are facing a constructivist challenge here, because we want to understand how participants in science, social science and research policy make sense of these emerging fields. And we're trying to understand in what sense what nano is achieved, it's kind of achieved as its definitions are achieved and intertwined with the membership talk as you go around and talk to those involved in nanotechnologies and nanoscience. And we're also drawing and trying to kind of consider the approach in technology assessment, which is called vision assessment, which Armin Grunwald is developing as well, which is also is kind of growing as a new direction in technology assessment, but also has its own methodological, epistemological and critical challenges as well. To give you an example, STS and TA had a conversation earlier. So if you look at the debate on the social studies of science in 1984 between Collingridge, whose dilemma of control became a popular tool in technology assessment, and Ron Johnston, you can see that there was quite a bit of disagreement about the stances that technology assessment needs to assume as the new field develops. For Collingridge, it was more about ignorance in policy about how science is being done in practice. He was talking about technological lock-ins, and he came up with the idea of the dilemma of control when it's not clear when you start to control new technologies, at the early stages or later stages, and whether it might be too late to begin controlling new emerging technologies. And he believed that better policy can be made based on a better description of reality. So the control dilemma can be completely solved, he believed, if policy has the accurate information and ignorance about science and technology is eliminated. But Johnston took a completely different path, take on that kind of question. He was a big proponent of critique of preparing fallibilism. That means that previous theories in science can be disputed or even rejected. He was also claiming that it's experts who are expert claims that are constitutive of the state of knowledge and technology, as science and technology do not exist in themselves. They're constituted through the assessment of their actual state, of their potential, and so on. He also was saying that it's not the accuracy of facts or technologies that is difficult to disprove and change, but experts themselves. He was following that kind of direct practice term, looking at experts themselves. And he was saying also that the control dilemma is not a tool for policy analysis, but it's rather the outcome of the dynamics of winning claims, not the result of their closeness to truth. Well, and in the end, if you look at the technology assessment as an institution and the emerging ways of doing technology assessment, like vision assessment, you will immediately recognize the familiar question of legitimacy as new approaches in knowledge production face when they're being introduced. So what is vision assessment? Is that a methodology? Is that a tool? Is that an element of the managerial policy discourse, or is it a mode of action and intervention? But also a question about how can we use vision assessment to understand how some technoscientific discourses become marginalized or others become mainstream. The other aspect for vision assessment is actually focus on visionaries, which is a fairly new term which is gaining recognition increasingly. It's attention to those leading figures in science and technology who are making claim. So we've written about Eric Drexler, we've written about Mike Rocco, we've written about other visionary figures in transhumanism and nano, and trying to understand how these initiatives have been assembled, what sort of work went into solidifying them into the national programs, and particularly in the United States. So the ultimate question for us too is how can we understand better the politics of non-positivist policy as well. So we do need to understand that we deal with possibly different interpretive analytic cultures where they meet to produce new policy instruments, new policy approaches as well. So we are talking about adequacy of description, whether that STS approach can adequately help to describe science and technology in practice. We are talking about multivocality, incommensurability, deconstruction of visions, what exactly we are doing when we're introducing these notions into technology assessment. Are we pursuing any particular policy or analytic ends? And what's the role of analysts, us as STS analysts, and the place for ethnography in this kind of policy exercises? What the ethnographic attention needs to turn to laboratories or policy organizations themselves. And for example, the ideals of, to what extent are we pursuing the ideals of non-technocratic policy by trying to bring together STS and science and technology studies? Is that about the increased forms of participation, or is it about politics of talk about public engagement in policy circles, which can be transformed in a topic for research in itself? So if you kind of wanted to bring you a definition of technology assessment from the work by Armin Grunwald, so according to Grunwald, technology assessment constitutes an interdisciplinary research field aiming at, generally speaking, providing knowledge for better informed and well-reflected decisions concerning new and emerging developments in science and technology. Its initial and still valid motivation is to provide answers to the emergence of unintended and often undesirable side effects of science and technology. And it shall add reflexively to technology governance by integrating any available knowledge on possible side effects at an early stage of decision-making processes, by supporting the evaluation of technologies and their impact according to societal values and ethical principles, by elaborating strategies to deal with the uncertainties that inevitably arise, and by contributing to constructive solutions of societal conflicts. Grunwald identifies four partially overlapping branches of TA. TA is policy advice, TA is medium of participation, TA for shaping technology directly, and TA in innovation processes. TA is institutionalized in a set of research policy and research institutions that are often engaged in policy advice for parliaments and other political institutions. While TA originated from the United States, it is now most firmly established in Western and Central Europe. This is a definition that Christopher Curtin and I wrote in the book on responsible research and innovation in 2013. STA. So there are some shared sensibilities between STS and TA that I would like to sort of put on the slide and ask you to reflect about them. There's some repercussions, as they say, as well. When you talk about TA, if you consider TA documents, you can see all this discourse about thinking and alternatives. And STS for a long time, if you remember Steve Woolger's talk in St. Petersburg, he was telling us that things could have been otherwise as one of the mottos of science and technology studies. TA will argue that technology is politics by other means. In STS, Bruno Latour was kind of telling us for a long time that technology is congealed social relations. TA is talking about heterogeneous futures, and STS has active network theory. So that's the book. Also Rachel quoted a chapter from this book as well. So, in a sense, this kind of discussions at the intersection between STS, TA and policy, there is a space for all sorts of questions about responsibility, opening up science and technology for public deliberation. So in a sense, there is more interest into how science and technology are done in practice, whether that can help us to raise ethical awareness about science and technology. There are also an increase in the social constructivist approaches when we bring science and technology studies in. How can we open up controversies over production of scientific facts? For example, the climate case. How about assessing technological promises if we talk about transhumanism and human enhancement? Are we talking about the new assessment regime when we move from management of innovation to governance of science in society? We also there's lots of critical discussion about codes of conduct for scientists and engineers, principles for responsible research, observatories for ethics, for example, in information and communication technologies, and also finance. There are all sorts of ELSA activities, ethical, legal, and social aspects of science and technology, and they critique as well to what extent actually help to promote science and technology rather than make impartial assessments about the state of the sciences and technologies. There's also some feminist critique can be heard in this kind of conversations between STS, TA, and policy. The inclusion of players that have recently been excluded from conversations about science and technology, which is an important achievement on this kind of conversation as well. Questions about who is responsible for shaping technological futures, the question that we started to discuss yesterday with Nikolai. And also, there's also lots of controversies about public engagement as well, because whether it's about consensus seeking or whether we still have to achieve some kind of truly deliberative practices in public deliberation. So in a sense, they're all the same kind of questions, but reinterpreted in this kind of new blend or merge between TA and science and technology studies about how we can achieve more open, transparent, and just socio-technical change. It's actually not a very long talk, because to summarize all this discussion, I just found this picture that I quite like. It's the Russian 1969 Winnie the Pooh cartoon and the American one. And I think, how can we start deliberating about the post-positivist governance of technoscience when the two meet? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Елена. And now let's start the questions.
Господин Журден, который всю жизнь говорил прозой, но только сейчас об этом узнал. Какую роль играет вот в этом научном направлении история? Потому что ведь замкнутый порочный круг ложных обещаний — это не 20 век, это как минимум начало 19 века. Это постоянная ситуация, и сталкиваемся мы с ней не только в нанотехнологиях, но и в любой другой отрасли знания. Как бы утопические обещания присутствуют постоянно. То есть в какой мере технология assessment включает исторический аспект? Или каждый раз проводится исследование так, как будто вот какая новость, опять утопическая появилась обещание?
Ну да, то есть какое из видений, what sort of vision is far-reaching in a sense. That's a question that I keep asking as well when kind of vision assessment. How do you define what kind of vision you make object for assessment as well? So I think it's kind of this strong focus on contemporary technologies because it's concerned about the world we live in, about how they affect us. And I think it's more about really focusing on what's going on in policy and science and technology these days.
Спасибо. Ari?
I'd like to add to what you were saying in your spirit, that there is also an element of criticism of the overall picture that you were sketching. If you look at the table where you had TA and STS, I think that is a very useful table, and you see a quite broad vision also for TA. But then in your earlier sort of brief history of TA, you let it start with the American Office of Technology Assessment, this emphasis on creating knowledge and solid knowledge for policy making. But if this is correct, then TA also at that time should have these elements. And you could think of OTA as being a reduction of what I tend to call a philosophy of technology design, what you have there. And my way of phrasing that, which links up both action and insight, is to say, okay, and let's call it the philosophy of technology assessment, since at least the 1960s, as an attempt to reduce the human costs of trial and error handling of technology in society. So to overcome the trial and error, you have to anticipate. But it's not because you want to create knowledge, but because you want to handle technology in society in a better manner. I think that is useful to introduce here as well, because that actually captures lots of the things that I've said in this slide.
Thank you. Steve?
In a way, I want to highlight one of the points that you were making that is, which has to do with the tendency of STS research, especially in this very sort of broad-minded interpretive way of becoming instrumentalized as market research, okay? Because I think it's true from the standpoint of how STS people are actually employed. The kinds of skills you're talking about most naturally lend themselves to kind of running kind of focus groups in a way, getting people to think about different possibilities for how technology might be received and so forth. And I think one of the problems that STS has had as it's developed is, in a sense, it's become a discipline that's in a way much more known by its methods than by any content. Okay, so there's a kind of STS style of doing things, and as a result, STS is kind of very employable, I think, in the policy arena. But it's kind of at the level of theory and so forth and substantive commitments pretty light. I think that's fair to say. And this goes to the point about the history, about the relevance of history. Because to my mind, as someone who, as it were, enters into STS from history and philosophy of science, okay, and in some ways that's often seen as a kind of precursor field. When we think about things could be otherwise, we often think about this in terms of counterfactual histories. Right? So in other words, if you want to have a good sense of how things could have been otherwise, you go back to the past when the future still was open and look at all the possibilities on the table and then do a kind of diagnosis as to why things happened one way and not the other way when there was room for maneuver. And then, and somebody like Collingridge, I think, was on top of that with the lock-in notion, right? And I think the problem is that by losing a lot of the historical perspective, so I agree with what your view about STS's relation to history is pretty marginal, in a sense. It doesn't really take it that seriously. Is as a result it ends up getting a very thinned out notion of what it means to be otherwise. So as a result, I sometimes worry that this idea of things can be otherwise ends up just being reduced to the idea that you can put another spin on things. You can give another interpretation. You can do exactly what you want to do, but you can kind of justify it a little differently to make it more palatable to your market or your audience or whomever. And that's kind of what I worry about as a result of our having lost the deeper historical perspective, is that we treat this idea that things could be otherwise in a much more superficial fashion.
Окей, Симакова, еще вопросы, пожалуйста.
And I always say technology assessment is not for me. And I was putting in the margin of my research interest because, I don't know why, but it seems to me that looking at this picture, there's two important issues which are somehow not addressed. And one is, I could call this, we can introduce in STS term the notion of heterogeneous community, which means a single scientist or engineer, a very small group of scientists and engineers who are felt somehow, I can use this kind of term, in love with what they're studying. And so they devote all their life to what they're studying. The nice example is Evelyn Fox-Keller's book about McClintock. I have my case, similar case in my studies. So for these people, when they're so deeply, tied to their technology project or for their cognitive project, all these issues are sometimes, in the corner, because what they want is their child, their new technology, to be born eventually, and they look at this as a gift to society, and also as a kind of self-fulfillment and realization. And in Barbara McClintock's case, we have, after 20 years, this idea of transposition, or we can some engineers who have spent I have in Novosibirsk, my case, Professor Tverduchev, who spent most of his life to building holographic computer memory. And he almost succeeded, but then his competitors, after 91, they destroyed, in literal sense, his devices. And he fell in heart attack and he barely survived all this. Now he's again highly cited, etc. So, I mean, all this idea of technology assessment somehow have to address that our relationship to this alternative vision are sometimes very strong, and some micro community or some corporations go to realize it in spite of all this social claim, etc. They're just convinced, and they go to the whole this kind of. And I think at the level of large corporations, this is also applicable, because you can see like Monsanto or some other, we're going to sell their crops in a similar way. So it's too much policy, and I can't see this, what we're talking now in this scheme, how it's addressed. Because we have this, that's my point.
Yes.
Can I set a rule? Can we make this session quite short?
Absolutely. I just have one small question and we can begin, you know. So yeah, I have a question. It can be silly, but I'm really curious. In technology assessment, how the agenda is set. I mean, should we use TA as a filter for, like a total filter for all kinds of technology? You know, every day, every week, every month, or there must be some mechanism to set up the agenda for TA, and then we apply TA. So how do you see that through this approach?
Yeah, well, the reason actually to make this session short again, it's a special issues out. There's been lots of reflections about how TA is done in practice, so that's why I wouldn't like to open it up now, and you can have a look yourself. But I would just say that generally talking to TA colleagues, I hear a lot about them being practitioners, generalists in a sense. They take technological project, there's one project after another, it's their everyday job, they write reports, often for the parliaments or European commissions. So it's routinely producing knowledge about assessments, knowledge about technologies.
Okay, I was just thinking about Victor's point on that technology is everything, so we can start, you know, doing TA for glasses, bottles, you know, plasmas, all sort of toys, of course, sexual toys, all kinds of toys. So where is the you know, borderline for like this is for TA 100%, and you know, people, you should participate, or don't worry, it's not about TA, just let it go.
Yeah, well, thank you.
All right. There you go. That's you, Tom.
Well, this is a dialogue between them.
Yeah, sure it is.
It makes perfect sense. Dialogue. Okay.
Maybe you can answer one question. Have an internal dialogue. Be reflexive.
Well, I think I'm gonna need Victor to help me with this.
But I also had a question to
Okay.
May I just wanted to go to make a step back to what just Steve said, and that's a very important thing, I guess, because what we are talking now about STS, what's going on there, that is lacking not only historical dimension, but also a theoretical one. And with the theoretical dimension, it actually loses this whole philosophical weight that actually was so important at the beginning. So, and my question is exactly about this picture as well. What actually, and it's also very stupid, what do we really mean when we say otherwise? Like, what do we really want to say when we say otherwise? Because when we say that technology is contingent, there's the whole philosophical idea of contingency, and all this huge debate about the world as an ocean of possible with the islands of actual. And this idea of contingent and blah blah blah, so it could be otherwise, it could be otherwhere, it could be somewhere, and so on. And now we just use it as a cliché. So there is no more so solid philosophical, hard thinking through behind it. We just made it an ideological point that is actually a common denominator both for TA and STS, as I can see here. So what does it really mean to say otherwise? What is the other here?
I can start thinking about that, but I think it's a question about the limits of knowing, in a sense. And there is this question and says, what is it that we don't know about technology yet that we have to study ourselves?
Because I think your question about history and then Steve's answer and your point are very important, but it's not necessary to get into sort of philosophical depths and philosophical doubts about it. What we've been trying to do with constructive technology assessment, working with nanotechnologists and policymakers, is to create both a diagnosis of the situation in a particular domain and a future scenario. And so in the diagnosis, we try to show, with the help of methods of history, recent history, innovation studies, STS, that there are always incipient and stronger path dependencies. So this sense of combination of contingency and history that then creates patterns, we try to start with, and then these things could have been otherwise is not just a reflection on the past, but it's also a way to start addressing the future. Because rather than thinking in terms of making choices, we say, okay, there are always dilemmas, there are new path dependencies developing. Do you want them? Now is the time to perhaps try to do something about it. So I'm saying this because then the sort of philosophical thrust of this notion of things could have been otherwise is translated into something that you could actually see as a methodology. And it works. I mean, I can sort of tell you stories. It doesn't work always. Pardon me?
I just want to translate it back.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Was coming from
it's just, I do think that there are two slightly different issues on the table. I don't take any exception to what you've just said, but you're talking about a context in which you might say STS-inspired work is part of a kind of a portfolio for analysis. And so you're bringing in other things as well. But I think what Victor is talking about is kind of the spirit of STS left to its own devices, where I do think there is a kind of privileging of the openness in the situation as it's studied ethnographically, and that history has a very secondary role against that. And see, because the thing is, if you actually go into the history and the philosophy of contingency, and you really take that seriously, you start having to deepen your social ontology. right? And insofar as STS has identified itself metaphysically, it identifies with a flat ontology, right? So there is no idea of, as it were, deep structures of history, you know, let's say political economy or something like that, which are more open or less open at various points. And so you could say, right now, the opportunity is kind of how it was in 1900, because in a sense, the economic situation is kind of opened up in a similar way. In STS, people don't really talk like that because there is no sense of a deep structure of history. They don't really buy into that way of analysis.
But then I'm not STS.
No, but you're in a practitioner mode. Practitioners are always eclectic.
No, not just in the practitioner mode. I mean, we've been doing history of technology.
But I think Victor is getting at, you might say, the pure STS, the kind of, you know, where STS is seen as a discipline with a specific kind of identity, and that is kind of how it was presented in the talk. It wasn't presented as just this thing that you can use with a lot of other things, but it was presented as having a kind of identity of its own, and that is the identity. It is an identity of a surface ontology that in a sense doesn't treat contingency as a very deep phenomenon.
Okay, thanks a lot for this interesting discussion. Thanks Elena again for this presentation.